I can see the coast of Maine, rugged and rocky, split between peninsulas and islands. And sometimes when I look out, I can't tell if I'm looking towards the shore or just another island. There are swatches of orange and yellow in the distance as fall is setting in, and it feels like a black and white filter tinted a dark blue, like an old film has been overlaid on the colors of summer. It's October and it's cold, and I am sitting in a boat by myself in the middle of the ocean. I have a bright red sailing jacket on with a neon yellow hood. Supposedly, if I fall in the ocean, you can see my head bobbing the thousands square miles of dark blue ocean. In the boat, it's a center console, steering wheel in front. There are containers for lobsters that we're collecting. There's a bucket full of rope. There's an oxygen kit, life preservers, scuba diving tanks. And about 30 feet away from me, there are 4 of my lab mates, including my advisor, wrapped in black neoprene in 40-degree water, looking for lobsters. And I can see their bubbles rising to the surface. But I'm sitting in the boat alone, wrapped with my hood up, and I'm staring down at my brown waterproof boots. My toes are cold, and I can feel the ocean bobbing the boat, and I can hear the waves lapping against the side. And I have this deep nagging feeling of not being good enough, of not being worthy enough, of not being strong enough. And I look out again at the bubbles coming up from the surface from my lab mates. And I think about how the ocean, it looks more like a glass floor than a glass ceiling. And I long to dive in to be with them. And the reason why I'm stuck alone in this boat is that after 6 months of training in scuba diving, when I started my PhD, I got really sick, and I got diagnosed with a heart condition after a week of awful testing. And I have an arrhythmia. And the American Academy of Underwater Sciences does not allow you to scuba dive or be a scientific diver with a condition like mine, nor the defibrillator device that was surgically placed inside me. And so after hours of weeping, when I got my diagnosis, I had felt like the whole purpose of why I had moved to Maine and changed part of my science career to become a scuba diver, to make that my life's choice, I felt like it had been cut out of me with a rusty, serrated edge, leaving this gaping wound in my ego. One of my committee members had said, he's like, this is a good opportunity. The best summer I ever had as a graduate student was when I was sick and I couldn't snorkel. He had a snorkeling project, so I got a lot of work done because I was the director of the data, and I could organize and I could think because I wasn't snorkeling all the time. And then there was the Marine safety officer at our station, and he had been in the Navy for 25 years, and he's like, I think it's so stupid how the guys who know the most in the lab, the head scientists, are the ones swimming down below while they leave the dumb intern in the boat. In the Navy, the most important person is up on the surface in case something goes wrong. And it's true. Surface support is really important. You're the first one that calls the Coast Guard. You're there to administer oxygen. You're the one that makes the decisions when someone has a heart attack, the bends, or a rare shark attack. But I worked in a dive lab, and so I did those things. I planned the dive trips. I drove the boat, tried to be in charge of the data, but never quite felt like enough. And one time I remember my advisor and I got into an argument where I was naive enough to think that we could do drafts of grant proposals in the 9th hour instead of the 11th hour. And during that conversation, he said, I don't think you're grateful enough. I don't think you're thankful enough for the other students in this lab who do your dive work for you. It was a dive lab. All of our projects had diving, and I wanted more than anything to be able to scuba dive with them, to pay them back in kind with their projects. But I couldn't. I wasn't allowed. I could drive the boat and do everything else that's required of a scientist. But scuba diving was where the work was. It's where the glory was. And so back in this boat, I'm sitting, basically feeling sorry for myself, thinking about all this. And by the way, this dive trip was not for my project, because I didn't study lobsters anyway. And I hear these breaths at the surface, and I think they're the scuba divers, my teammates, and I look up, and instead, about 10 feet away, there are 3 or more dark, gray, slick, dog-like heads with long whiskers and beady black eyes, gray seals, and they're staring at me, and I'm staring at them. I do this for a couple minutes, and then all of a sudden, without a sound, they disappear. And so I, knowing seals pretty well at this point, start looking around for a boat, specifically a lobster boat. And that's because seals are actually very good at taking lobsters out of lobster traps. And fishermen, some fishermen, I don't think have any reservations about shooting them on sight. So they know what a lobster boat sounds like, but they don't seem to mind other boats. So I start looking around and I see at the edge of this rocky island, all of a sudden this lobster boat turns around the corner about a quarter mile away. And once they come in sight, they're heading towards me, and there's not much else that they could head towards because it's such a narrow channel between these rocky outcrops we call islands. And once I can see the shape of 2 men, I wave at them, I have a dive flag, don't run over the divers. And they start heading right towards me. And I get kind of nervous and excited because when 2 strange men approach you on shore, for me, I would be a little bit nervous, right? Like, who are these people? But out on the water, even though you're way more vulnerable out here on this essential desert, it's kind of exciting because they're coming over to say hi. They might be checking if you're poaching and have a reasonable excuse like you're a scientist, but they're probably coming over to do something good. And once the guys are in view, I can see them. They're wearing flannels or t-shirts, and they've got ball caps on, and they've got their Grundens, their waterproof overalls that are bright orange and yellow. And they're warm from hauling all day. They're not wearing their jackets, and their rock music is blaring. And they go, hey. I go, hi. And they go, do you want a bucket of warm water? It's not clean or anything, but it's warm. And I sort of like, oh, they must mean like warm water for the divers, for their gloves and booties when they come back from being in the cold water. And so I dump this 5-gallon bucket of rope out on the boat and hand it over to them, and they fill it with this warm, steamy water, and I carefully bring it over to the side of the boat, and it's got bleach in it, and it's been warmed by the engine, and it's salt water, so it's got all these dead crustaceans floating around in it. And I go, thanks, and I point over to the divers. I go, they'll really appreciate it. And they go, oh, no, it's not for them, it's for you. And I go, oh, okay. And they take off, go look at more lobster traps, and I'm still there in that moment because they noticed me. They didn't care about the divers, which was my whole life. They cared about what was going on with me, and they probably knew that the worst part of a day out on the water is just not working, just sitting there waiting to be useful again out there in the cold. And I felt seen for the first time in a couple years out on the water, seen on this, in my mind, this 2-dimensional desert that wraps around the globe, that's between the vast ocean below and the vast sky above. It can be a really lonely place. But I think for a minute, and I look out at this beautiful seascape before me on the coast of Maine. Fall is just the most beautiful time of year out on the water, even though it's bitterly cold. And I can hear the terns calling and the seagulls and the waves lapping. And I start to think that maybe I do belong out here on the water. And so I take the warm bucket of water, it smells bad, and I take one brown waterproof boot, and dip it in, and then I put the other in, and then I begin to feel a little bit warmer everywhere. Thank you.